Sure. Thank you, Becky. And hello to everyone. There's a lot of my clients and colleagues and friends who have signed up for this, and I really appreciate your support. And there's lots of folks that I'm meeting, albeit invisibly in one way, through this great platform that Becky and Weaving Influence have. I've done a previous webinar with Becky, and so I thought it would be fun to do this again and to have this conversation. I will say that this topic is such that I can do a whole day workshop. I've done 3-hour workshops, and certainly when I'm working with clients, this is an ongoing discussion over a period of quite some time. So I do want to let you know you're getting what I hope is a tasty and nutritious appetizer plate today. And if it leaves you hungry for more, there'll be some other resources there. So welcome everyone. Thanks a lot. And I will also say that the things that I'm talking about today is stuff that I was as bad as anyone in terms of not having these skills. It took me probably 2/3 of my adult life to realize both the need and then to get these skills and to practice them on an ongoing basis. So don't feel like you'll walk away with this from this with a magic wand, but again, I hope you find it interesting and stimulating. So back to you, Becky.
Sure, let's try my sound again. One of the things I wanted to make sure everyone was aware of is that some of you may have received actually a survey from us, and this was a topic that many of you hand selected for today's webinar with Flip. The other thing I want to let you know is that we are going to have a couple of surprises toward the end of the broadcast, including a demo and a contest. So we hope that you will stay with us until the very end of today's event. And we are recording today's event. So in the event that you have a colleague or a friend that you would like to share today's event with, we will be making the recording and a PDF of Flip's slides available after. So before we dive into the content, I want to tell you a little bit more about my friend Flip Brown. We were talking before the broadcast began about his very interesting career history. So for about 18 years, he has been running his company, Business Culture Consultants, which, as I mentioned before, is a B corporation, and he's in his 18th year. But before that, Flip did things like being a furniture craftsman, a ski industry executive, a nonprofit program coordinator, an organic vegetable gardener, and at one time he was a rock and roll musician. So Flip has worked in a lot of different areas, met a lot of different people, and brings a unique perspective to today's topic. I think that as far as I can tell, we're doing okay on our sound now. So let's go ahead and dive into today's topic so we can all learn together. Starting with this very important definition of supportive confrontation. Can you explain to us what you mean by that, Flip?
Sure, Becky. Well, I think for many of us, when we hear the word confrontation, we automatically assume that it's a negative. And if you look it up in the dictionary, one of the definitions of to confront is to present someone with information. I could confront you with the fact that you just won megabucks. I don't think you would be upset with me. So part of this is reclaiming this word confrontation to have it have a positive connotation. And that's why I attach supportive to that. So we're putting good energy and effort into addressing a value or principle that we experience as being disconnected or out of alignment. We use some specific skills to do that, and we'll talk about those in the next few slides. And seeing conflict as an opportunity to deepen our relationships, strengthen our teams, and enhance our organizations, boy, when that happens, it is so cool. And I am very privileged to have worked with a number of organizations who reach that plateau and now live on it, where the things that aren't working well, again, they're just opportunities, and they recognize them and they move through them, and everyone has not only a better experience, but there's more success in the organization.
So framing difficulties as opportunities for growth and learning.
Yep.
So Flip, how do we determine the principle or find out what really matters when we're having these supportive confrontations?
Well, one thing that I think is important for any business organization is to define their values. And most organizations actually have some sort of value statement. So if you don't, it's not that hard an exercise. So that's what we hold as the key or core um, standards or principles that we have made a shared commitment to. And we do that with a certain amount of positive energy rather than, oh, well, this is what we believe in. Now, those values have to be experienced in an authentic way. And when they're not, we need some additional tools to deal with that. And that, again, brings up the opportunity for supportive confrontation.
Great, that helps. So let's talk a little bit about how we can effectively communicate in those stressful situations. And if possible, I
So,
think, yes.
yeah. So it's interesting how language is something that we all share, and yet we all use so differently. And, for example, one of the most unhelpful phrases is you need to fill in the blank, because very few people, when we start a conversation with that, say, oh, thank you. I had no idea I needed to do that. It usually provokes a defensive response. So I use this term joining language, where I either speak from my own experience to invite the other person to speak from their experience, or talk about what we have in common ground, our commitment to the values and the principles. And then if we can stay in that place of not making the other person wrong or bad, we can describe the gap between what we're experiencing and the expectations, assumptions, or commitments. But we have to sort of train ourselves to do this because oftentimes when we start one of these difficult conversations, our frustration is at a high level.
Yes. And just as an aside, I'm curious. Well, I guess we're going to get to that one later, but I'm going to have to hold on to it. So you've mentioned to me, Flip, how important active listening is in this process. Can you tell us more about that?
Sure. Well, it's when we're in a place of not being stressed out or not being involved in a challenging conversation, we can describe what active listening is. But it often goes out the window as soon as we are engaged in a difficult conversation. So, one way to define that is the ability to actually set aside our agenda or what we're going to say next to accurately capture and reflect back what the person is saying. Because it's almost impossible to get 100% accuracy 100% of the time, partly because we use language in different ways, and partly because we have our own filters in place. Um, a classic example is if my wonderful wife says to me that she wants improved communication, and I agree with her that yes, it would be good to have improved communication. We still have no idea what our beliefs or assumptions around that is. So it really involves almost like a mindfulness practice to be able to simultaneously be aware of our thoughts and feelings and open ourselves up to what the other person is truly saying.
That helps. And you mentioned, Flip, that it's really difficult to do that when the stress is high. So what
Mhm.
happens when we get frustrated or we lose our cool?
Well, I call it getting pulled off center or being triggered. And, there are some folks out there who are absolutely gifted at finding our buttons and pushing them. Um, and so when that happens, it's usually a signal that something else is being activated for us. Some old pattern of feeling disrespected or not validated or not seen or heard. And when we get into that space and we project our negative energy onto the other person, then they can just view us as the problem, and that kind of just is the end of the game, or it turns into a ping pong match. Um, so this is where that ability to stay centered is so valuable. And my all-time favorite role model for this is someone by the name of Obi-Wan Kenobi. Now, I realize not everyone has seen the Star Wars movies, but he demonstrated that in a really wonderful way. Nothing pulled that dude off center.
Well, so can you give those of us who maybe aren't as familiar with those movies some input about how to stay centered when we get into those stressful situations?
Well, I say that if we can think about how we want the other person to engage with us, and I like this phrase, being curious rather than judgmental, because oftentimes by the time we find the courage to initiate a difficult conversation, we've already made certain judgments and assumptions, and then we try to use logic and reason to get the other person to buy into that. Of course, they're going to come back at us with their own logic and reason why their viewpoint is the correct one. So if we're open and curious and we can listen well and we can monitor our own emotional reactivity, boy, if the other person does that as well, then we can actually move into different territory. So, this art of healthy detachment, a quick little vignette. Years ago, I had an opportunity to do some work in the emergency room of our local hospital. And what I realized is that when you work in the ER, there are no emergencies. You just deal with whatever comes in. You know, this person has a panic attack, this person has the flu, this person has a gunshot wound, this person has already passed away. You just meet everyone where they're at. Because if you had your strong emotional reactions, you wouldn't be able to be of service. And I love this quote by Otto Scharmer: the success of the intervention depends on the interior condition of the intervener. Boy, that is just so helpful to me. And I try to keep that in mind and practice it constantly in my work.
That is a really helpful quote. And Otto is a great guy. We had him recently on one of our events, so you're in good company, Flip.
Yeah.
So, in talking about attending to our own interior condition and, approaching any difficult conversations in a centered way, what happens if it doesn't work the first time?
Well, I think we gear ourselves up for these conversations, and then maybe we make some progress, maybe we're met with a defensive response. Um, but if we're talking about patterns rather than just a simple single scenario, it may well take a number of conversations over time. And so, if we take a longer view and we realize that we can still have empathy and compassion for people that we disagree with, it may be helpful to lower our expectations. Because one thing that I think we look for in these conversations is validation. And that that may not be realistic to get in the workplace. It may not be realistic to get in the way that you're looking for. Um, and this also is an important factor in terms of power dynamics. So if we can find a way to speak to anyone, um, regardless of how they're going to respond, because we already have our fundamental basic human goodness, and that's our center, then we can move through these difficult conversations in an easier way.
That's really helpful. So let's talk a little bit more about how this relates in the workplace. So what does this have to do with, my workplace or the workplaces of the folks who've called in today?
Well, if we go back to the core values or standards or principles, again, I find most organizations can be pretty articulate about that. The next step, which is significantly more difficult because very few of us have the training and the experience to see and describe the observable behaviors that either aid or constrain the values. And so that's an important step. And then the last part of the process that I use is to talk about the balance between hierarchical accountability and mutual accountability. And what I mean by that is that if things are out of alignment, if the values or the behaviors are not, in our experience, in alignment with our agreements and commitments, then the art of supportive confrontation is a primary tool to initiate the conversations so that we can continue to move forward as a relatively healthy and productive culture. And when we take those appropriate risks and people don't make it or take it personally, that deepens our trust and we get better outcomes.
Sure, that helps.
And quite frankly, if it was that easy, I'd be out of a job.
Yeah, I think that it's easy to hear about it. It's more difficult to actually live out. So how long do you think it takes to do this well?
Well, you know, if you go to a yoga class or a meditation class, and I hope you do, I certainly do and have and will continue. You know, if you go 2 times and you say, I got it, I don't need to go back. Well, we understand that there is no perfection in yoga or meditation. It's a practice. And so if we view this way of engaging with others and ourselves as a practice, you can actually see, oh, here's a situation where I get to use my skills and move through this. I travel a fair amount, and you know, when the flight is canceled or there's some confusion with the hotel booking, I try to find a way to demonstrate empathy and compassion and connect with the other person, even though I'm stressed out and I need something to be different. So if we practice this with peers, friends, colleagues, and again, I've had more than one client say, "Well, you didn't tell me this works well at home too." It's just a valuable life skill in my experience.
So the short answer to how long does it take to do this well is probably my whole life. Is that what I'm hearing, Flip?
Well, I think that in terms of culture and organizational life, you start to get some traction after 2 or 3 months if you really are practicing this and having these kinds of conversations. I think it takes generally 6 to 12 months to fully implement it and integrate it. Because again, these are patterns where we're looking at our own personal history and experience and awareness and tools, and then we're bringing that together in an organizational context. So yes, it certainly takes time to get to the first plateau.
Sure. Well, so I'm excited about what we're going to do next. This is something I don't think we've ever done on a webinar before. We're going to have a demonstration, and we have a special guest who's going to join, and I'm going to go off camera. And so I'm going to do that now, Flip, and hopefully our guest will be able to get on camera.
Sure. Well, you know, I think that for most of us, when we're in these kinds of conversations, we don't get to observe it. Um, we're in the middle of it. And so this is a scenario that many of you have probably experienced. Um, and so I am in the role of having to initiate the difficult conversation. But it's important you know that this is not rehearsed. I don't know how this is going to unfold. And when I do this in workshops, I have small groups come up with the scenarios. And so Jennifer and I have had a conversation just enough so that we know what we're doing here, but neither one of us knows how this is going to go. And I thank Jennifer, and you should thank Jennifer for volunteering. So her job here is to actually make me squirm. So I'm going to play the role of a business owner initiating a conversation with an employee. So you ready, Jennifer?
Yep, I'm all set.
Okay. Well, Jennifer, when you came to work here at Gotham Graphics and Digital Design, we were so excited because you brought a passion and an energy and, you know, just fresh eyes. And it just was really cool to have you join this team. So you bring great value in terms of your energy and your creativity. And it's just important that you know that.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah. And so now that you've been here 3 months, there's some things that I want to discuss, and I, I want to be upfront. I feel somewhat uncomfortable bringing these things up because even though I'm the owner of the company and the founder, I really like it best when I'm not the manager or the boss. I like it when we can work in a collaborative fashion and self manage. However, I do have a responsibility to you and the company to make sure that we're working well together. So I just wanted to let you know that there's some things here that I do need to bring to your attention.
Okay.
So we signed a major account, as you know, with the California Organic Prune Growers. And, you came up with this great tagline, prunes, imagine the possibilities. And so we need to develop a campaign with the graphics and the packaging. And I thought that we were pretty clear that there was a deadline for those materials Friday at noon, and it's now Tuesday afternoon, a little past 12. Can you bring me up to speed in terms of where those materials are at?
Um, yeah, it hasn't quite been finished yet. I was kind of waiting on Susan for some feedback, but I haven't heard from her. Um, and I didn't follow up with her on it as of Friday.
Mm-hmm. Right. So, are you aware that we have a call with the client tomorrow afternoon?
Yes, I am aware of the client call tomorrow.
Okay.
Um, I should be able to have my part of the project together. Um, Really, I was just feeling a little bit overwhelmed with the volume of work that was involved in this contract.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so I'm curious, what kept you from having that conversation with me?
Um, Really just worried that I was going to let you down. Um, I've only been here for 3 months and I really want to do good work for your company. And I feel like I appreciate the recognition that I get. And then, so it's hard to come to you when I'm struggling. And I guess I just thought it would resolve itself maybe if I didn't approach you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well,
Maybe someone would reach out to me to help.
right, right. Well, even though this is important, it's important to the company, it's important to our revenue. I have to smile a little bit because I recognize a bit of, I'll say, my younger self in you, in that you both made an assumption that somehow it would all work out, and um, without really taking ownership of it, you practiced what I'll call some benevolent avoidance. Is that a fair statement?
Yes.
Yeah, yeah. So this is part, I think, of a larger pattern here, in that because you came to us as a freelancer, I think you're used to setting your own parameters around benchmarks and timelines, and things work differently here. Is that match your experience?
Um, yes, but I do also think as a freelancer, and as other freelancers, I'm being singled out a little bit here. It wasn't just me that was working on this project. And I mean, if I dropped the ball, so did Susan on the same thing. We were working on
Mm-hmm.
it together.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, if it's just me being the object of the conversation, I really don't think this is a fair start to the problem.
Yep. Okay. Well, I will obviously have a conversation with Susan, because you're right. She did have a role in this. My understanding that you were the lead designer on this project. And so if that were the case, what do you see as your responsibility here in terms of either meeting the deadline or communicating in advance of that?
I guess instead of waiting for somebody to come to me for help, or to ask if I need help, maybe reaching out first, instead of assuming that I'll have somebody checking in on me. I think
Mhm.
maybe that's what I was expecting coming into role in a company instead of working on my own.
Yep. Yep. Yeah. And so do you feel like if you came to me, I would be harsh or judgmental, or that I would you would experience me as intimidating?
Um, I don't think I was intimidated as much as I was worried about the disappointment,
Uh,
um, of not getting my task done or not being able to complete what I needed to do in the time that was allowed.
Right, right. So looking back, can you see that the disappointment that I might have had on Friday morning would have been much less than my disappointment now?
Yes.
Yep. So one of the agreements that I would like to make and keep going forward is that at the first sign that the project is not working well, either because somebody's not getting back to you, you don't have the resources, you don't have the information from the client, or any other bottleneck, um, I empower you to take responsibility to bring that forward. Because when you do that proactively, then we can provide solutions. As it is, I do believe that you will be able to get things together because I think you can work well under pressure. But that's going to mean that I'm going to have to change my schedule and Susan as well in order to pull a rabbit out of the hat here.
I just didn't want to like seem like I was throwing other people under the bus if I wasn't getting things completed because of other people. Like, I guess coming across as a tattletale.
Right.
Like, I need this from Susan in order to complete my next steps, and I should have just addressed it better.
Right. And so going forward, I think that as a team, we can work on this in terms of, again, making the assumption that by initiating a conversation, even though it may feel difficult, that bad things will happen. It might feel uncomfortable, but in the end, we'll all work better together. Does that make sense?
Hmm.
Okay. Well, thank you, Jennifer. Appreciate your ability to listen and stay engaged here. Thank you.
Okay.
All right. Let's give Jennifer a
Hey, a
hand.
flip.
Thanks. Thanks. So I think
Oh,
that in this scenario, a couple things. One is that Jennifer could have been much more closed down, stubborn, argumentative, but this to me was a classic case of what I would call diffuse responsibility. She didn't see that she had a responsibility to communicate proactively and made some initial attempts uh, to see if her excuses would work, which, all of us have been in my position where we have to then be the judge and jury on that. Um, and so hopefully you got a chance to see a little bit of how this process works, albeit in a very truncated form. So, Becky, any comments from your end about this little scenario?
Sure. Well, I think observing it, I felt a little stressed. I'm curious about the attendees. Obviously, in leading people, there are times that you have to confront them about performance issues, and I find that to be something I avoid whenever possible. And Pamela, one of our attendees, mentioned that the tech issue provided a classic example of avoidance, which I think is funny. I'm curious, for those of you who are watching, if you have any questions related to the demonstration or any comments about the demonstration or any questions in general. Yeah, I think that your persistence, Flip, in trying to be able to bring people, to bring Jennifer back to an agreement about what your expectations were and what she could do was really helpful. Some of our attendees said, let's see, a great way to target an issue by addressing what you were feeling and your own frustration without attacking. And Gina says she likes how you handled the "it's not fair, others are also to blame" issue, and handled that deftly. Now, here's an observation from someone saying that she would have felt very called on the carpet and pushed if the business leader had that kind of conversation with her. Mm-hmm. And here's a question. So besides listening to seek a better understanding, what steps do you recommend at that point? Wow, tons of observations here. I'm going to hold for a second and see if you want to address that question. So besides listening to seek a better understanding of the issue, what other steps do you recommend?
Well, I think that, and I want to address the other person's comment as well, is that yes, if I don't address Jennifer and the fact that, in my experience, we had a clear, specific deadline around work output, and I have no conversation, then that's going to have some negative impacts on the team and the business. And there's no easy or perfect way to do this. One of the things that I feel very strongly about is that one should never, ever try to work out a business, or for that matter, personal, but a business relationship issue via email. So rather than sending Jennifer an email about, hey, you missed the deadline, what's happening, we got to call with the client tomorrow, I chose to initiate a conversation. And had this been longer, I would have been able to have a conversation about this is becoming a pattern. So yeah, people can feel in the one down position, because there's honestly a power dynamic difference here. I try to be sensitive to that, and do the best I can. So I think that I was attempting to clarify what our basic values and principles were around commitments to do work. That if those commitments need to change because a coworker didn't provide the information or whatever, then that needs to be brought forward so we can take action.
Sure. So I have a comment here from Gina who said that she really liked your approach of saying, here's an agreement I would like us to make and keep. And so she was flagging that as language that she would like to implement.
Yeah, I would call that example Stacey, joining language.
Are you joining language? Yes. Stacy's mentioning that she really appreciated how you stated that you were wanting to empower your employee to bring forward issues and to come up with solutions. And she felt like that was very empowering. And here's a question from Jay. So Jay is wondering what recommendations you have when you're on the receiving end of the conversation. So maybe, I'm the employee who's getting called out because I missed the deadline. In what way can that person be more effective in the conversation?
Well, I think the most valuable tool is to make sure that you're able to capture what is being asked of you. So if we reverse the roles and Jennifer is the company owner, if I were able to say, well, I think what you're saying is that you had an expectation that I didn't meet, even though for me there were other factors going on that caused me to not take action. Because if we can capture accurately and the other person feels heard, then it's much more likely that they're going to be able to hear us. And then in that situation, I would almost certainly feel like, oh, I'm being scolded, or I'm being called on the carpet, whatever. That's a natural emotional reaction. And so, what do I do with that emotional reaction? I can honor it, I can feel it, but then I can put it in the proper perspective and not have that color my engagement with the other person.
Okay, I hope that helps. Jay did ask a follow-up. So what if you're on the receiving end of some feedback and the person bringing it to you isn't being supportive? So someone is bringing you, negative feedback. They're not doing it in a supportive way. How can you, as the recipient of that feedback, handle that confrontation, um, you know, with grace to be able to turn things around?
Sure, that's a great question. Well, I think first of all, don't take the bait. In other words, don't get pulled into an argument where you're defending yourself and then the other person sees that as resistance because nothing will move forward. An amazing tool in a situation like that is actually silence. When we just sit and listen, and let the other person go, sometimes 3, 4, 5, 6, 8 minutes. And then we say, okay, is there anything else that you would like to share with me? That often takes some of the steam and heat out of the argument. It's hard to do because our brains are like, I need to respond, I need to respond. Um, and sometimes we have to take care of ourselves in a way that the other person will never know or never understand. Ultimately, if you're on the receiving end of a continued pattern of negativity and you have no options, then, at least in terms of business, at some point you have to question whether or not this culture is a match for you. And some people do grow themselves out of an organization.
And I know that would be a hard decision to make for sure. Dawn is wondering, Flip, if you have any recommendation for where you should have a conversation like this. I mean, obviously with Jennifer, you were doing it virtually with cameras. So is there an ideal setting? Should it be in the supervisor's office? Should it be in a conference room? Should it be off-site? Where's the best place to have difficult conversations when they arise?
Well, this is a great question, and I would say if you are a supervisor or an owner, if you're in a position of power, do not sit behind your desk. Take your chair, pull it around to the other side. Try to have chairs at the same height, same kind of value. That's one tip. Secondly, this is I'm going to wade into a little bit of gender stereotype here, but I think that most men will respond to a conversation that involves walking in a different way. I'm not saying always better, but in a different way than sitting face to face. That's just, cultural training on one hand. And I think to the classic, let's go out for lunch. Going out to lunch or going for a beverage, in a public place is great if you're doing what I call the listening tour. In other words, you really want to get open, honest feedback from the other person of what their experience of working with you is like. It is not a good place to initiate one of these art of supportive confrontation talks. So yeah, confidentiality can be important, and trying to equalize the situation is another.
Well, I think the whole face-to-face thing, whenever possible, is really powerful. Flip, when you said, notice I didn't send an email to say why did you meet the deadline? I think I have a team that's virtual and in person, and it's easy to rely on project management tools, for example, as a means of calling out deadlines that are missed. But that is not always the most important, not always the most effective approach. So, yeah, John is saying he really appreciated your respectful approach in holding someone accountable and forcing restate expectations. And in reading that, what I'm wondering about, Flip, is when you prepare for a conversation like this, do you have your talking points prepared in advance? Here's the agreement that I want to end up at eventually, or is it something that you discover as you have that conversation?
Well, there's a quote I love from the Swiss psychologist Carl Jung, and I can only paraphrase it, but he says, study your theories, read your books, listen to the masters, and then set all that aside and open yourself up to the mystery of the human being who sits before you. So these conversations, it's as important to understand how you feel as what you're going to say. And in this case with Jennifer, I knew that if we showed up on this client call in the scenario and were not prepared and had to make excuses to the client, that would not be good or fair, even to Jennifer and the quality of her work. So that's a core principle that I need to find some way to address. And I also want to find ways to stay in connection with Jennifer throughout the conversation. I want to balance both of those things.
That makes sense. So going back to the scenario, Paul has a question here, and he's wondering perhaps Jennifer might have needed some coaching about how to confront her team member Sue, and when and how to escalate issues to you or to someone else. Any thoughts on that, Flip?
Absolutely. And I think that, yeah, this would point up that perhaps I've been too busy and perhaps I have made assumptions about Jennifer and Susan's ability to have these conversations. And then the question is, am I the best person? What are my skills as a coach? I may need to bring in someone from the outside. I may want to find someone who's going to coach all of us. So yes, that would definitely be a need in this situation. And I would want to do that in a way that Jennifer sees that as an investment in her professional development so that we would get her buy-in. Because another point is that in this scenario, I was trying, although I wasn't explicit about it, that there's both mutual accountability. In other words, we're both working on this account, but there's also hierarchical accountability. And in my experience, you need some of both in the right proportion, in the right situation. And it's always an interesting dance.
That makes sense. So here's an observation from Laura, which I thought was really helpful. She noted that she really appreciated that you use questions that began with something besides why, because why tends to create defensiveness. So she loved your question of, can you give me an update on that? Instead of, someone might say, why didn't you get that done? So I thought that was an interesting observation. Angelica is wondering, Flip, when you have these supportive confrontations, is it valuable to have a third person involved in the meeting?
Ooh, that's a good one. I would say that if there's a risk management issue, harassment of any sort, unfortunately, that still exists far too often in our culture. Something like, potential embezzlement, you would want to consult with an employment attorney. Aside from that small, narrow category, I think the only reason to have a third person in there is if both parties agree that that person could sort of provide the role of a coach or a supportive observer. Because if things go off the rails and if in this case Jennifer just shuts down, then I'm going to have to respect that and find another way to come back. Now, if I lose my cool, that's way more serious because I'm now contributing to a toxic culture. And as a leader, boy, you do that kind of damage. If I start yelling or accusing, that takes a lot to repair. And if I don't have the awareness of that either in the moment or shortly thereafter to apologize and make amends and change that pattern, then all bets are off.
That So Wade is wondering what he might be able to do in his organization to make employees more empowered to discuss issues. So is there a way for a leader to shape a culture where people feel open to share these supportive confrontations with one another?
Yeah, there's a key phrase I like called appropriate professional vulnerability. So any of us in a position of leadership, if we can talk about our awareness of the fact that we have blind spots, talk about we're aware of certain patterns that need our attention, um, and if we're truly open to feedback and we're willing to actively give people permission to take those risks, then that's really important. You know, it's like the classic leader who says, "Who's got a good idea?" And everybody says, "Well, I know what your version of a good idea is, and mine doesn't match that, so I'm not going to offer it." So we really have to demonstrate the openness, the vulnerability that we would like to experience from others.
That's really helpful. So model the behavior that you want to see in your organization.
Yep.
Gregory is asking, what should happen as it relates to documentation of a conversation like the one you had for Jennifer? And how do you see these types of conversations fitting into or not fitting into a disciplinary process or structure in an organization?
Well, that's a longer conversation. I think that the documentation in a situation like this is an initial conversation about a specific account management issue. If it becomes a performance issue that I feel then as a business owner I would need to start taking notes because we're potentially looking at a fork in the road, then that falls more under the HR perspective, and I would get a consultation if your business is too small to have an HR person.
That's helpful. Thanks, Flip. And for anyone who's been putting questions and comments into the question panel, we appreciate them so much. And if there's anything that you need clarification on, please feel free to go ahead and put those in again. And there have been so many, Flip, I'm just trying to scan through. I know there are a few things that I have not asked that came in earlier. So if you can just bear with me for 1 second, we'll figure this out. Well, here's interesting back to your conversation with Jennifer. Someone's wondering how you could keep your calm, you know, if this were really true that there's a deadline about to be missed. In what way did you prepare yourself so that you could stay centered in that stressful situation?
Right. Well, I benefited from a lot of other teachers and coaches and thought leaders, and Roz and Ben Zander wrote a great book called The Art of Possibility, in which they talk about rule number 6. Rule number 6 is don't take yourself so damn seriously. What are the other rules? There aren't any. So this is important. This new account, we want to keep them happy, but I just need to find a way to have a connected, effective business conversation with Jennifer, and get some results, both in terms of what I call task management, but also in terms of relationship management. And again, it is a practice to stay in that centered place when the compost is hitting the fan.
Got it. So it does what you're about practice. Here's a comment from Jay that he says that what he feels is really missing in most organizations is safety and clear alignment on expectations. Do you have any comments or any tips about how to get that alignment?
Well, it generally starts with those who are the owners, leaders, managers, because if they're trying to manage without a reasonable amount of emotional intelligence, it's going to be difficult. And I think that the word safety is a very interesting concept because, on one hand, of course, we want physical safety, in terms of ergonomics and things not falling over and stuff like that. Psychological safety is a very interesting concept because if you say, you can never do anything to make me look or feel bad. Otherwise, I'm not going to feel safe. That means you can't take any risks. And it also means that you could say something that I'm going to interpret far differently than your original intent. So safety to me means that we have the tools that when the disconnects come up, we can recognize those and move through those without feeling injured or disrespected. Conflict in any relationship is inevitable. And as a musician, if you listen to classical or rock and roll music, the structure actually sets up tension and then resolves it, and we feel great when that happens.
Well, so Flip, could you summarize how all this works and give us some essential steps as we wrap this hour together?
Sure. Yep. So trying to boil this down in a few bullet points, and it's a very complex topic, as I think we've explored today. What is the core disconnect? Because I think frequently we do search for the why, or we get stuck in our frustration before we can identify this core element. The skillful use of language and listening, again, this is something to practice over and over. Emotional awareness and intelligence that 30, 40 years ago, emotional intelligence wasn't even a concept in the business world. And now we recognize that what we're feeling and our ability to both sense and in some cases intuit the emotions of the other person is as valuable as our intellect and our use of words. This does take courage to step into these conversations. In fact, one of my clients came up with the term courage for clarity. And when they use that, people just know what that means. It means that we need additional clarity, and let's figure out how to get there. And then over time, this is like adding Lego blocks. You can't do it all in a week, a month, a year. And then when you make mistakes, and you will, and I could probably go back to the recording with Jennifer and say, oops, I would have liked to have said that differently or done that differently. I like the term composting our mistakes, because in my garden, the stuff that doesn't make it gets put on the compost pile to fertilize next year's growth. So those are the essential steps as I see them.
So what are some specific steps that we can take after participating in today's event?
Sure.
And Aubrey, yes.
Yeah, find a peer, a mentor, or a coach. And sometimes if this stuff is old family related stuff, it might be helpful to talk to a counselor. I know I've certainly benefited from that experience. So the idea here is that we all have some deeper patterns that if we can decode those, that will give us more information when we get triggered. Look for low risk opportunities to practice. Sometimes it's interesting to say, hey, can I try this conversation out and have somebody else play the part of the difficult person? As I said before, don't take yourself too seriously. And to link this to the values in your organizational culture, I just can't stress how powerful that can be when organizations adopt this as a core way of working together.
Well, and finally, I forgot to mention at the beginning of the call that there is a chapter about this topic of supportive confrontation in your book, Balanced Effectiveness at Work, How to Enjoy the Fruits of Your Labors Without Driving Yourself Nuts. One of my favorite book covers ever.
Well, and yes, and I did my first webinar with Becky and Weaving Influence. And is that still on your archives, Becky? Can people access this Work-Life Balance is Dead?
I think so. We can try to find that link and include it in our follow-up email. That would be fun to go back and watch.
Yeah, indeed. Yes.
Well, so in terms of follow-up items from today, you mentioned a contest. Are you going to share with us about the contest?
Sure. And again, if you have any questions at all that weren't answered, email me. I promise you I will answer them all. So the little contest is that I would appreciate your feedback in terms of what you liked or what you didn't like. And, any sort of feedback. Now, you could say, are you aware that, the light shines brightly on the top of your head? Yes, I do know that. But any suggestions, comments, and Aubrey, if you could jump to the next slide, please. So the first 5 responses that I get, I will give you 3 free hours of phone consultation on any topic that we've talked about, or maybe some that we haven't, and a free copy of my book. The second 5 responses get the 3 free hours, and the third 5 will get a copy of the book. Happy to do that, and no, I won't add you to my mailing list. So I see we're coming up on the top of the hour here, and I just want to thank everyone for joining us for this conversation. This commitment to continuous learning and growth is part of what Weaving Influence promotes. I think everyone on this call is probably interested in that. And I'll leave you with this, the 3 hearts of business. You need a warm heart, a strong heart, and a light heart to make this world a better place.
Thanks so much, Flip, and thanks to all who have participated with us today. We look forward to being in touch with you with a follow-up email, and it's my deep hope, Flip, that as a result of today's webinar, there might be some folks who might hire you to speak or consult in their organization. So we'll provide more information about that in our follow-up email.
Well, that would be frosting, but I've enjoyed the cake.
Have a great day, everyone. Bye-bye.
Okay. Thanks. Bye-bye.